So today we're going to continue talking about features of the shape of the ocean floor. And if we get a chance, we may start actually moving into an explanation in a bit more detail of how that shape came to be. We've already, of course, talked about isostasy. Essentially that the oceanic and continental crust and the attached part of the uppermost mantle are floating on a deformable part of the Earth's mantle, and therefore the more dense, less thick oceanic crust and lithosphere floats lower. The more thick, less dense continental crust and lithosphere float higher, and the oceans tend to be over the low-lying parts of the Earth's surfaces, therefore over the oceanic crust and lithosphere. But why is there oceanic crust? Why is there continental crust? Is going to be an interesting question to try to answer as we go along. So just to keep you up to where we are. So what we've been discussing for the last day is this sort of picture and why it looks the way it does, in particular why there's this dichotomy between areas that are very close to sea level or just above sea level, which basically correspond to the continents, and areas that are a few kilometers below sea level that basically correspond to the oceans. It's not perfect. There are these light blue regions which are actually very close to sea level but slightly under sea level and therefore part of the ocean, strictly speaking. Okay? And you can see that, for instance, in a histogram where you just plot the relative fraction of the area of the Earth's surface at various elevations. There's a big peak right near sea level or just above sea level, and there's another broad peak around 4 kilometers deep or something like that. And the explanation we arrived at on Wednesday was essentially this reflected differences in the elevation of the surface of blocks of the Earth's crust and uppermost mantle, the lithosphere, floating on deeper parts of the mantle that are so hot that they can flow, even though they're still solid. Okay? And the idea is then that continental crust, being the thickest and least dense type of crust, the surface is going to tend to float highest. Oceanic crust, being somewhat more dense and much thinner, is going to float a little bit lower. Okay? And so continents stand high, oceans sit lower. This idea is an idea of isostatic balance, essentially floating, buoyancy of the uppermost layer of the Earth on deeper, denser layers of the Earth. And there are, of course, more details. So we've talked quite a bit about continental margins, in particular passive margins, like are typically found around the Atlantic Ocean, but also occur elsewhere. We've talked about abyssal plains, these broad, flat areas of the seafloor. And now we're going to, for the rest of the lecture today, probably talk a little bit about a couple of other features, in particular these funny arcuate-shaped or roughly linear, in some cases, very deep regions of the Earth's ocean, often found right near the edges of continents or right near chains of islands. In this case, this is the Marianas Islands. Here's a big trench. Okay? There are also trenches along the west coast of South America, Central America. There actually is kind of a trench off the northwest coast of the United States, Washington, southern British Columbia, actually, but that one's not so prominent on a picture like this. And finally, the mid-ocean ridges. Okay, so a useful point to make while we're talking about the shape of the ocean is how we know what the shape of the ocean is in the first place. So as we pointed out in the first day of class, sunlight only really penetrates a couple hundred meters into the ocean. Most of the ocean is much deeper than that, average depth about 4 kilometers. So in general, you can't sail around in a boat and look down and see how far down the bottom is. You actually have to send down a plumb line or by some other way detect where the bottom is. And so there are actually a couple methods that are used nowadays to determine what the shape of the ocean basins is. How deep is the water? What's the bathymetry of the oceans? And so I'll run through the two main resources just so you get a sense of what their relative strengths and weaknesses are, and to give you a sense of how we know what we know about the shape of the seafloor, and particularly trying to make the point that there's a lot we don't know, actually. So the one that might make the most sense, be most familiar to you, is sonar. If you've ever seen like an old World War II movie where the submariners are trying to escape from the battleships or the destroyers that are out to get them, you'll hear the pinging of the sonars trying to detect the submarine underneath the water. And you can do the same thing just to see the bottom. So if you have a boat, a research vessel, and it has a sound source either in the hull or can be towed, presumably. Sends that sound beam down. It'll bounce off the seafloor because the seafloor has different acoustic properties than the water, and come back up to the ship. The ship listens for that echo, and if it knows how fast the waves are traveling through the water, it can back calculate from how long it took that echo to come back to it and figure out how far it must be to the seafloor. Okay? And roughly, if you know the speed at which sound is going through the water, and you know how long it takes that echo to get back to you, that's a two-way trip, right? It has to go from the ship down to the seafloor and come back up again. So it's going twice the depth. So you just divide that by 2, and that gives you roughly the distance to the object that's returning that echo. Now, things are much more sophisticated than that now. We have multi-beams that actually can send out multiple beams at the same time and sample areas of the seafloor that are to the side of the ship as well as directly underneath it. And so a ship traveling along in the ocean can actually map out a swath of the bathymetry of the ocean that's several kilometers wide. And this is just an example of a picture that's taken, a bathymetry map that's made from multi-beam sonar data taken west of the island of Vancouver, which is off the northwest coast of North America. So this is Vancouver Island right here. You can't really see it very well, but that's where it is. And there turns out to be a mid-ocean ridge that's right offshore there. And so this is the depth to the ridge, with the reddish colors being shallow water and the bluish colors being deep water in this picture. And okay, one thing you can see right away looking at this is clearly you can only see how deep the water is in the areas pretty close to the track of the ship. Okay, you can only see the bottom of the ocean out to some distance to either side, a few kilometers. Okay? The other thing you can see, hopefully, even sitting in the back, is that there is a tremendous amount of detail in this picture. So it's possible to process this data to get very precise, very high resolution information about the shape of the seafloor. Okay, but in general over relatively small areas. And this has not been done over the entire ocean. There are some parts of the ocean you can't really send a boat to, covered with ice or whatever. And there's many parts of the ocean that just very few ships have ever visited. So often this is done for particular areas of interest or near busy shipping lanes. If you have a research vessel and you're coming back to port, well, you may as well turn on the sonar and just measure along the way while you're driving back to port, for instance. That does not give you a global picture. To get a global picture, we need a better perspective. In particular, we need to sit farther up above the planet. And so global bathymetry relies on satellites nowadays. This is a picture of one of the more recent satellites that's used for determining the shape of the seafloor. This is Jason 2. Before that, there's Jason 1, and then there's Topex Poseidon. There's actually a Jason 3, I think, now. And the way these measure the shape of the seafloor is actually kind of roundabout and indirect. So I'll try to give you a thumbnail description of it, but actually don't worry if you don't understand quite all the details. It's kind of complicated. I actually would struggle to present all the details if I didn't have a PowerPoint slide here to help me. But the basic idea is that these satellites are set up so that they can very precisely measure how far they are above the surface of the ocean. Okay, so they can measure how far down is the water surface. They don't actually directly see the seafloor. They see the water on top of the seafloor. Okay? And furthermore, these are able to determine by communicating with stations on the surface of the Earth on land where exactly they are in space. So they know their position in their orbit very precisely. So they know where they are in their orbit, and they know how far they are above the ocean surface. So they can very accurately determine where is the ocean surface, how high is that ocean surface. Okay, so the tricky detail is, okay, if you know how high the top of the ocean surface is, how do you figure out where the bottom of the ocean is, right? That's what you really want to know here. And this is determined by mapping out the geoid. Okay, and the basic idea is if we took the Earth and stopped it, okay, and let everybody stand back up, and stopped the winds from blowing and stopped the ocean from circulating, what would happen is that the ocean would just come to rest, right? And it would arrange itself across the Earth's surface so that it was, to the extent possible, filling in low-lying regions of the Earth's surface, right? It would be flat, like water usually is in a glass of water or whatever, okay? And that surface is an example of a geoid, okay? The water is fallen down to the point where it's everywhere surface is perpendicular to the acceleration of gravity. Gravity is pulling it down. The water, if there's a hill over here and a trough over here, it fills in until that surface of water is perpendicular to the direction of the gravity. Okay? So imagine you're over a part of the Earth where there is something like a mountain. Okay? Rock is more dense than seawater, so there's more mass here than there is here. Okay? Because there's this big lump of relatively dense rock instead of less dense water and air there. And of course, gravity is the tendency of masses to attract each other. And so you would expect gravity to kind of point a little bit towards this mountain and a little bit away from this region of the Earth that is just covered with water and air. Okay? So you would expect in that place for gravity actually not quite to be pointing directly at the center of the Earth, but actually displaced a little bit towards the mountain. Okay? And that's what these little lines with dots are supposed to show. This is the line going down to the center of the Earth, and here's a direction indicating which way gravity actually is pulling in the vicinity of this little mountain. Okay? And so what happens is that the geoid, the surface that the water would occupy if it was completely still, okay, actually gets pulled a little bit towards the mountain because the mountain has a little bit of extra gravity in it. Okay? And so what the satellite is essentially measuring by looking down and measuring very precisely the height of the sea surface, it gets something that can be processed into this surface if we know something about ocean currents and other things that might actually move the ocean surface up and down. And it can detect where is there extra rock, where is there extra material near the Earth's surface, and where is that material not present because there's extra water there. Okay? And so it can actually take the shape of this geoid and infer from that how much rock or how much water must be present underneath it. Okay? So it's backing out the shape of the rocks underneath the ocean surface by looking at the shape of the ocean surface itself and assuming that it's being perturbed by changes in the gravitational pull when you have extra rock in one place or extra deep ocean that doesn't have as much rock in another place. Okay. Now, it's in the nature of this kind of exercise that you can imagine, okay, there's going to be some uncertainty involved. We don't know exactly how the ocean is moving. And furthermore, this is kind of a broad brush thing, right? You're looking through kilometers of ocean water. You're not going to see every little bump and rill on the ocean floor. You're going to see big things. You're going to see big mountains. You're going to see big valleys. Okay, so this is kind of low resolution technique. You see overall what the shape of the seafloor is, but you don't see it in nearly as much detail as you would with sonar measurements. But because you're looking down from a satellite, you're seeing a lot of the planet at any given time. And satellites move really fast. And if you set up your orbit cleverly, the satellite eventually goes over pretty much the entire surface of the Earth, in fact, over and over again. And so you can measure the Earth's geoid and infer the shape of the seafloor for the whole planet or most of the planet over and over and over again over a period of years. So this is the way to get a global, consistent map of the seafloor shape, and then you can supplement that with detailed information spot by spot using towed sonar or multi-beam sonar. Okay, are there any questions about that? I know it's a little bit much. Yes? I'm sorry? The point I was trying to make is that the geoid would be if the ocean wasn't moving anymore. So if you stopped all the ocean currents, if you stop the winds blowing across the surface and storms can pull up the ocean like a storm surge, for instance, if you're able to sort of make the ocean still, it would follow a geoid surface. That's what I meant to say by stopping the Earth. That's a good question, though. But let me clarify that point. Any other questions? Okay, so on Wednesday we talked mostly about passive margins. Just to refresh your memory, this is the east coast of North America. So here's Florida down here, Virginia and Washington, D.C. New York is up here, Boston's over here. And this is an example of a passive margin, which are common around the Atlantic Ocean, where you have fairly broad, flat, shallow shelf. Okay, it can be hundreds of kilometers wide, ballpark number to keep in mind of order 100 kilometers. Then there's a slope break There's a relatively narrow continental slope and then a broad transition in this deep sea floor over hundreds of kilometers. Okay. We can contrast that with an active style margin, which is common around the Pacific, so sometimes it's called the Pacific style margin. And, well, hopefully you can see this. It just jumps right out at you. So here's what we were just looking at. Here's Florida again, okay, Cuba, Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, Central America, and here's the Pacific coast of Central America, and it looks very different. Okay? In general, it's much narrower, and you go from either land or fairly shallow seawater very quickly into very deep ocean. There's not this gradual transition like we saw on the Atlantic margin. Instead, it's kind of straight down. Okay? And actually, there's a trench here. So not only is the ocean water particularly deep here, it's deeper than it is out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Okay? Typical abyssal plain depths in the Atlantic, something like 5 kilometers. In this trench, it might get 6, 7, 8 kilometers. Okay, so something very different going on than this gradual transition we saw around the Atlantic Ocean. Okay. Deep sea trenches actually vary a lot from place to place, these characteristic features of active margins. They can be as deep as 11 kilometers in the case of the Marianas Trench, but often aren't super deep like that. They may be only 5 or 6 kilometers deep. There are fairly narrow features on the Earth's surface, typically less than 100 kilometers deep, depending on exactly how you define them. And interestingly, they're associated with lots of other features. Volcanoes. Okay. Southwestern Mexico has lots of volcanoes in it, so does Central America, particularly around Nicaragua. They're associated with really strong earthquakes. Mexico City, of course, has suffered many destructive earthquakes in recent history. They're pretty common in South America, and in fact, it turns out wherever there's an active margin, there's typically a strong danger of earthquakes, damaging earthquakes. And this goes for, by the way, the 2 earthquakes that have happened this week. We've had 2 very large earthquakes occur in the world this week. There was one, the most recent one, near Sumatra that was felt in Singapore and elsewhere, and another one near American Samoa that caused the tsunami. Those are both examples of earthquakes that occurred near these active margins, near trenches. And so I mentioned that these active margins are pretty common around the Pacific, and sometimes they're called Pacific-style margins. Here in blue, more or less, are outlined deep sea trenches, the characteristic feature of this type of margin. Okay? And you can see that around the margin of the Pacific Ocean, there are lots of these. Now, that's not the entire inventory. There are, in fact, a few, like off Puerto Rico and Hispaniola. There's a deep sea trench in the Atlantic Ocean. Turns out it's not. There's another one in the Atlantic south of South America, southeast of South America, in the Sandwich Islands. There turns out to be one in the Mediterranean Sea, but by and large, most of them are found around the Pacific in one way or the other. And this is sometimes called the Ring of Fire because of this association of oceanic trenches, volcanoes, and earthquakes. Those 3 things really do go together. Okay, so just in a little bit more detail, this is a map of the Earth, again, showing the location of the earthquake that happened, I think, on Tuesday, the American Samoa's earthquake. Has a magnitude of 8.0. We don't use Richter magnitude, which might be the word that sounds most familiar to you. That turns out not to be very helpful for describing the size of very large earthquakes. So for very large earthquakes, we use this moment magnitude, which is a proxy for how much energy was released when the earthquake happened. So American Samoa is located here in southwestern Pacific Ocean, kind of near New Zealand and Australia. And this beach ball, it's actually called the beach ball diagram, although the fancier name for it is a focal mechanism, is intended to show what kind of earthquake actually happened here. In this case, it was a kind of earthquake that happens when the Earth's lithosphere, the brittle part of the Earth that's actually capable of breaking and therefore making an earthquake, pulled apart. Okay, this focal mechanism, that beach ball, is indicating that there was a pull-apart earthquake, as opposed to, let's say, a pushing-together earthquake, or the type of earthquake that's most common in California, where the crust is moving side by side past each other. Okay. This is actually kind of weird that this was such a big earthquake in this particular area where things were pulling apart. And when we get to the end of the discussion of plate tectonics in a week or so, I'll try to remember to come back to this, and we can discuss why this is particularly weird that things are pulling apart here. Okay, so we've talked about passive margins, we talked about active margins. I have sort of pointedly not talked about California. We are, of course, on the Pacific Ocean, so you might guess that we have an active margin, and it's sometimes classified as active, but it's a weird active margin. We don't have a trench offshore of Southern California. Okay? In fact, if we look at a bathymetric map of our local area, it's weird. It really is weird. There are relatively few places on the planet that look like this. So this is the LA basin. UCLA is right about here. If you were to go down to Santa Monica Pier, it's right about here. Okay. Palos Verdes, Catalina Island, Orange County. This is San Diego down here. Santa Barbara is right up here. Okay. And what you see when you go, starting from the Mojave Desert up here, working your way towards the southwest offshore, is not a passive margin for sure, right? Which is flat areas near sea level gradually transitioning into flat areas just below sea level, and then a slope break and gradually deeper water. We definitely don't have that. Okay, we have these big mountains, some of which come right down to the coastline, like the Santa Monica Mountains near Malibu. We actually have mountains offshore. Okay, but we also don't have an active margin of the sort I've talked about. Okay, it takes quite a while to get from land to deep ocean. Okay, something like 100 kilometers. That transition takes place over. It's not a stair-step function like we saw off the coast of Central America. And it's this weird undulation thing, right? Goes down, comes up, goes down, comes up, goes down, comes up, goes down, comes up, goes down, and finally goes down gradually to the seafloor of the deep Pacific Ocean. So we have a goofy margin. Okay? No broad flat shelf. Instead, we have these mountains and valleys alternating with each other, and it turns out that many of them are bounded by faults, some of which cause earthquakes, many of which cause earthquakes, including, by the way, the San Andreas Fault, which comes right across here. We have ridges, some of which actually poke up above sea level to form islands like Catalina and the Channel Islands. And we do have a slope, which transitions into a fairly normal depth Pacific seafloor without a trench that occurs quite a ways offshore. Okay? So this is what you might call a hybrid or a mixed type of margin. It's not really active, it's not really passive, it's a funny kind. And it turns out to be a particular expression of LA's plate tectonic setting, which we'll get to in some detail. But it's worth pointing out that LA is actually one of a series of these low-lying basins as you go from the interior of North America offshore eventually, and that the only reason we're above sea level really is because we're relatively close to the mountains onshore. There's lots of sediment being delivered to the LA basin, or at least there used to be before we channelized all our rivers, and so it's essentially filled up what used to be a fairly deep basin in Los Angeles. And so we're basically, particularly if you go south towards like Venice, you're basically standing on a giant pile of sediment, and that's the only reason you're not below sea level. Okay? The actual basement is very deep. That's also part of the reason why LA is here. LA is, I think this is still true, the most productive county in the country for petroleum production. We don't usually think of LA perhaps as being an oil town, but that's really what it is. Even before we had movies, LA is full of oil, which comes from sediments. Okay, it's because we're sitting on this giant pile of sediments in part that we have so much oil. Okay. So that's the discussion of margins, but of course we still aren't done talking about all the features on the seafloor. And in particular, we haven't discussed these funny things, which aren't abyssal plains, even though they're very far removed from the continents in some places. They actually stand high. Okay, maybe only 2 or 3 kilometers below the ocean surface instead of 4 or 5 kilometers or 6 kilometers below the seafloor. And they pretty much ring the earth like the seams of a baseball. And here's another picture from it's just a different visualization of the same data essentially, but it makes the ridges even more apparent. You can see them running up the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, for instance. Okay. These are the longest mountain chain on our planet, something like 60,000 kilometers long, greater than the distance around the Earth. And they're pretty high, actually. They get up 2 or 3 kilometers above the surrounding abyssal plain. So from 5 or 6 kilometers deep up to only 2 or 3 kilometers deep. In a few places, they actually poke up above sea level to make islands. In particular, Iceland, which is right here, is right on the mid-Atlantic ridge, but actually sits up above sea level and makes it about 1,000 meters above sea level at the highest point. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this thing. So here's, again, a map of the shape of the seafloor and the continents. So we're going to focus in on the Atlantic Ocean, which has a particularly simple ridge in the middle. Okay. So this is just a blow-up of that image. Okay, so here's West Africa. Here's North America, Cuba, Puerto Rico. And here's the ridge, okay, running, in the case of the Atlantic, right down the middle of the ocean. And you can see it's got these bumps and crenulations on it. It's not really flat like the abyssal plains are. And it has a broad, gradual flank gradating into the abyssal plains. So let's focus in a little bit more closely still to see what this looks like in detail. So we're going to focus in on this area between the Caribbean and West Africa. Okay. So now we've focused in pretty far. Here's the ridge again. And when you get this close to it, you start to see a funny little feature of it, which is that there's actually a valley running down most of the middle of the ridge. Right near the crest of the ridge, there's actually a little groove. Okay? And that groove, it depends on where you are in the ocean, but it can be something like 1 kilometer deep. It's generally not very wide. Okay? It's observed, particularly nowadays, that there is ubiquitous volcanism, lots of volcanic rocks being erupted right near this little groove at the center of the ridge. Okay. There are frequently earthquakes observed along these ridges. So volcanoes and earthquakes tend to go together. That shouldn't be too surprising. And even stranger, there are these weird offsets that happen. So here's the ridge, then it shoots over here, here's the ridge, jumps over, goes up here, jumps over. It has these weird right angle offsets to it. So this is the Atlantic. If we look at a picture of the Pacific, which also has mid-ocean ridges, but they're called rises, it should be clear looking at this picture why it's called a rise instead of a ridge. This has got all these bumps and wiggles and grooves in it, right? And these fracture zones that are really clear. The Pacific is much smoother. Not lots of bumps and wiggles and ridges. And there, in many places, isn't a distinctive valley running down the top part of the ridge. Okay, there's still offsets to it, however. Those fracture zones, those right angle offsets are still there. But the details of how bumpy the surface is actually vary depending on where you are in the ocean. Okay, so here's a question for you. Why are the ridges there? Why are they ridges? I'm sorry? Okay, so one potential explanation, this is a place where plate tectonics is pushing things together and sort of crumpling them up. That's very sensible. Turns out not quite to be right, but that's very sensible. Yeah? Okay, so essentially exactly the opposite idea, that this is a place where things are moving apart. But how does that make it high? Uh-huh. Oh, I see. So it kind of has to push it up, and then it kind of falls off to the sides. That's actually not bad at all. That's one idea for what kind of happens, actually. This idea of ridge push. That's a bit beyond, actually, what I was going to hope you would come to. That's a very good idea. That's an idea that geologists still argue about. Okay, in terms of isostasy, right, we learned that things float, right? And what controls how high they float? Density, and what else? Thickness. Okay, I'm just going to assert that the thickness of the crust here is the same as it is everywhere else in the ocean, more or less. Crust is no thicker here. So what else would that leave? Density. Why might this be less dense? It's hotter. That's right. There's a nice little plume of magma coming up, as you pointed out. If material is warmer, it's generally less dense. Okay? Hot things tend to be less dense, and this actually turns out not to be an exception to that. Okay? The crust is the same thickness, but it's quite warm because it's right next to volcanic eruptions that actually itself just crystallized from magma. In addition, the mantle underneath it, particularly, because it's hot enough to be melting there, is less dense than the mantle underneath the other parts of the ocean. And so it's not dragging it down as far as it would elsewhere. The lithosphere under the mid-ocean ridges is actually very thin and relatively less dense because the mantle is hotter under them. We'll come back to this. You don't have to absorb it all right now. So are there any questions about these basic features of the shape of the oceans? All right. So we're going to pursue this even farther, and we're going to try to answer a couple of our own questions, which are, okay, continental crust floats high, that's why you have land there. Oceanic crust is floating lower, so that's why the ocean's covered up. Okay, that doesn't really explain why there's oceanic crust and why there's continental crust, right? It just says if you have continental crust of this density and thickness, it's going to tend to float high. But it doesn't say why there's these two kinds of crust in the first place. And these other features of the seafloor in particular, why are there trenches? Why are there mid-ocean ridges? Why are these, as we talked about when we were talking about abyssal plains, often these tracts or groupings of seamounts and islands to make chains, like the New England seamount chain, or as it turns out, like Hawaii and the Emperor seamount chain? Hello, computer. There we go. So it turns out that the explanation for this lies in something really important for you to get from this class, and that is the theory of plate tectonics. These features you see when you look at the shape of the Earth in a surprising amount of detail are actually explained by the idea of plate tectonics. And plate tectonics, basically the word, you can split it apart. Plates is referring to rigid plates, regions on the surface of the Earth that in and of themselves don't deform very much. Okay, so a plate pretty much keeps its shape, doesn't get squished very easily, doesn't get pulled apart very easily. It's just sitting there floating around on the Earth's surface as a unit. Okay? And tectonics, it's a little bit more difficult to come to, but it's the idea of the way these things actually move around, are created, and are destroyed on the Earth's surface. Okay? So this is actually, to the extent there is such a thing, the unifying theory of all the Earth sciences. Okay, not just oceanography, but geology, geophysics, studying earthquakes. Okay. Paleontology turns out to owe a lot to the idea of plate tectonics. Some areas used to be very close together. The animals that lived there had very close relationships with each other. So you would expect, for instance, fossils to reflect where things were in Earth's history, on which plates they occurred. It explains the locations of the vast majority of earthquakes on the Earth's surface, the vast majority of volcanoes on the Earth's surface, the pattern of the age of the seafloor, which we haven't talked about much yet, but we're going to come to in some detail. And as I mentioned, the shape of the Earth's surface, which is really critical from the point of view of oceanography. And it's important also to point out that this isn't a very old theory. In fact, it was accepted only in the mid to late 60s, broadly speaking, although there are precursors to it much earlier than that. And so as a unifying theory for a major branch of natural science, it's kind of the youngster. We knew about evolution, which is kind of the unifying theory of biology, in the 1800s. And it was broadly accepted by the end of the 19th century. And quantum mechanics is an early 20th century feature. And of course, both of those things, just like plate tectonics, are still being refined, still being tested. But this is kind of the baby of them. And it's interesting to think about why. Why is plate tectonics kind of the last one we got to? And it's pretty simple, actually. It's an oceanographic thing. It turns out the best evidence for plate tectonics is under the water. And so it's only when we started looking underwater in detail that we realized that this stuff must be going on. And that was quite recent in human history that we began looking underwater in detail. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the theory of plate tectonics as kind of an example of how scientific methodology works, bearing in mind that actually science is a human endeavor, and different people do things different ways. And so the textbook description of hypothesis and test and result and theory and law, it's broadly true, but in detail, of course, every discovery has its own little story. Okay? But broadly speaking, scientific method is the process whereby we build up, as scientists, accurate models of what's happening in nature. Okay? And the goal of these models is to be accurate. We want a model that's going to describe what's actually there. So we want it to be consistent, not arbitrary. Okay? Essentially, so it makes sense. And science is very critically concerned with empiricism, the idea that you go out and measure things. And when you're trying to formulate an explanation for what you're measuring, you try to formulate that explanation in such a way that it makes predictions for other things you can go out and measure. Okay, so we're always thinking about what can we measure, how can we prove this, what extra data do we need. Okay? And of course, this is not exactly a stereotypical photograph of a scientist, but it might be something like what you might have in mind when you think of a scientist working, somebody hunched over a microscope looking at slides, in this case probably of microbes, because this is Rosalind Franklin, who is a prominent molecular biologist. Just bear in mind that in earth science, we of course do lots of stuff under microscopes, particularly at UCLA. We have some very nice microscopes that we use. But we also have to look at broader scales because we're looking at a very large phenomenon. And in many cases, we can't run experiments of the sort you would normally think of, where you mix things up in a beaker and you see what happens in the end, right? When we're talking about something like the evolution of a continent, we can't really make our own continent. We don't have the means, we don't have the time. So when we do testing, we actually do testing in slightly different ways. Essentially, we try to come up with a prediction for a measurement that you can make on the natural world as it already is that would be consistent with the explanation you're proposing. Okay. So from the point of view of understanding the development of the theory of plate tectonics, this is a very non-stereotypical image probably for you of a scientist, but this turns out to be the guy who's at the heart of the thing. This is Alfred Wegener. This is actually, tragically, a picture taken only a couple weeks before he passed away on an expedition in Greenland. Alfred Wegener was primarily known as a polar explorer. He had many expeditions to the poles, or Greenland in this case. But he's critical to this story of how plate tectonics works as well. Okay, and the basic idea of how scientific method is ideally supposed to work is you make observations, or you come across some body of observations that you want to make an explanation of. And so you try to come up with an explanation in the form of a hypothesis. The critical element of a hypothesis being that it's something that explains the data that's out there, okay, and also makes predictions about data you don't have in hand yet. Okay, so it's not just post hoc. It's not just, oh, this is why that happened. It also has to have an element of, this is what's going to happen if you do this. Okay, it has to make predictions. Okay? And this is a critical distinction. You can, of course, come up with just so stories, just like if you were reading Aesop's fables or something about why the fox has its tail. Okay, that may make perfect sense, but they don't make predictions. That's not scientific. And so it turns out that Alfred Wegener's main contribution to plate tectonic theory is that he came up with sort of a predecessor idea in the early 20th century of continental drift. The idea that the continents kind of floated around the Earth's surface and rearranged themselves over geological time. So how did he come up with this idea? Well, actually, it was an idea that preceded him by a long time. And the basic observation is this. Once we had maps of particularly the land masses around the Atlantic Ocean, which was the first one explored, at least by Europeans. This is Africa. Here's South America. This is the South Atlantic Ocean. North America is up here. Europe's up on the top there. Okay, and if you look at this, it looks a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, right? It looks like South America kind of fits into that little crook of West Africa. And so you can imagine, okay, I can sort of put these back together and come up with some ancestral arrangement of the continents on the Earth's surface, where South America is squeezed right up into Africa. And in fact, you can play this game with the other continents as well, putting Australia on the other side of Africa, kind of cramming Africa up into Asia, putting North America up against Europe, and so on and so forth. Okay. And what Wegener did is he took this idea that there might have been kind of a jigsaw puzzle-like rearrangement of the continents on the Earth's surface and really put some teeth in it by saying not only do the shapes of the continents kind of match up, but some details of the geology, the types of rocks you find on these continents, also seem to cross these jigsaw puzzle piece boundaries. In particular, distributions of things like fossils from, let's say, 250 million years ago, a 20th of the way back in Earth's history, sort of go from South America to Africa, or Africa to India, or even Africa to India to Antarctica, just right across like there wasn't an ocean there. Okay, you see the same animal or the same plant, like the plant Glossopteris, in Australia, in Antarctica, in India, in Africa, in South America at the same time. Okay, and you don't see them on the other continents, only there. Okay, other fossils, things like old mountain belts. Okay, there are lots of features that actually seem to cross right across these continent boundaries in exactly the way they would fit together if you just fit them together like puzzle pieces. Okay, so not only is it this happenstantial match of the outlines of the continents, but actually the structures, the materials deposited on those continents seem to match up across those puzzle piece boundaries. Okay, in particular, when you're looking at things that are older than, let's say, 200 million years old. So one explanation for this, the kernel of a hypothesis, might be that, okay, if we go back before 200 million years ago, these continents were all stuck together, and that's why they had the same kinds of animals living on them. That's why they had the same kinds of plants living on them. And the reason their outlines look like they fit together by jigsaw puzzle-like features is because they used to all be together and then they broke apart like fragments at some point around 200 million years ago and are now separated from each other by oceans. Okay? So the basic idea is something like 250 million years ago, the Earth was arranged like this in a supercontinent. All the continents or most of the continents crammed together into one large landmass, and that those continents then split apart to make something like the arrangement we see today. Okay? And this idea, by the way, held up. Okay? This is a more recent version of the same idea. This is from the Paleogeographic Atlas project run out of the University of Chicago. There are similar efforts being run in Arizona and the University of Texas, I think. And if you look here, this is supposed to be a reconstruction of what the Earth's surface looked like about 250 million years ago, at the end of what we would call the Permian period, or the Tartarian. And it's a little hard to see probably from the back of the room, but this is the outline of North America. Here's the outline of South America, Africa here, okay? Australia and Antarctica over here. Here's Europe. Asia's a little funny looking because it's actually split up into pieces in this particular model. So that idea is actually kind of held up. The continents used to be together as one landmass, something like 250 million years ago, and have since split up. But continental drift as a theory never really caught on. Some people kind of liked it, but geology as a whole basically rejected it in the 20s and 30s. It didn't really catch on. And so the question is, why didn't that happen? Let's evaluate this hypothesis. The idea that the continents used to be in one landmass and split apart. They drifted across the Earth's surface away from each other over time. Okay. Does this hypothesis follow from the initial observations? Does it explain the stuff that was kind of the kernel of why we generated the hypothesis in the first place? Who says yes? Who says no? Okay, overwhelming majority says yes of those who choose to vote. Did that hypothesis make predictions? Could you come up with a prediction based on what you knew, what I've just said? What kind of thing might you go and measure or go and look for that would provide further evidence that the continents had once been joined together?
That they're being split further apart.
Okay, that's very good. So let's say you could very carefully measure the distance between a point on Africa and a point on South America. If you measured that very accurately, you might see that they're growing farther apart over time. And you could say, they're still moving apart, right? And if you go back in time, they must have been closer together. That's actually very good, and you can do that today. 1920, not so much. Yeah?
Since he said that there were certain animals that crossed, like if there was nothing, you could check for fossils or for plants to see if the remains are still there. And that would prove that at one point they certainly were together, but then
Yeah, so you could go back and fill in details associated like this, right? You could say, okay, if North America is up here at the same time, there should be fossils going from North America into Africa, for instance, or from North America into Europe, which is up here. You can certainly do that. What doesn't this explain? There's kind of a big problem here, particularly given the title of this class. The oceans. What's up with the oceans? We just learned that there's oceanic crust, right? There's this kilometers thick pile of basalt at the bottom of the oceans. Does this say anything about that? Not really, right? If that ocean didn't used to be there, presumably that oceanic crust didn't used to be there. So where did it go, or where did it come from, right? This kind of failed in part because people had trouble believing that the continents were just plowing through rocks on the surface of the Earth without really very good evidence that those rocks were getting plowed up and messed up. The ocean floors are pretty flat, right? You have these big, broad abyssal plains. So the trick is, this doesn't really explain what's going on in the oceans. When we come back next week, we'll learn about exactly how the oceans contribute to the story and how you go from continental drift to plate tectonics.